Well, I'm Bob Smart. I'm retired Forest Service. I'm also kind of a community activist. I've been doing that for the latter part of my life here. Well, I was Forest Service brat. My dad had started in the Forest Service in the hurricanes in New England, and then and so that was one of the first recollection that I had that I really didn't know what he did, but I did know that there was a thing called forestry. And we went back and forth across the country, and then eventually he went off to the Second World War, and that's when my mother and I moved to North Carolina. So we spent some time down there, and then when he got out of the service, we ended up living. First place probably I remember would be the 9 Mile Ranger Station, which is really that was a show place for Region 1. Region 1 included Washington and Oregon, not Oregon, but Washington, Idaho, Montana at that time. And it was a real show place that started back in CCC era. It was just whenever somebody wanted to know something about the foresters, they would come to 9 Mile and learn about this place. And in addition to being a regular ranger station, it was also the remount for the Region 1. And that meant that there were hundreds and hundreds of mules that would come into the place during the course of a summer. And they were, at that time, there were so few roads that you ended up, the mules was a backbone, kind of how do you fight fires where you need logistical support. So that was a big part of what was going on in my early part of life. And then at the same time, the smoke jumpers began to come into play. And so our house was about 2 or 3 miles from the smoke jumper base in Missoula at 9 Mile. And that's where Red Skies of Montana was filmed. When you see the buildings of Red Skies of Montana was there. And I got because of the whole story about the fire, the people who had died on the Helena, I got very much immersed in fire and smoke jumping and what that whole program was about. And it was, it's quite a story into itself. Well, one of the things that I've talked about before that a lot of people have interest in is that I was helping. My mom and I needed to pick up the jackets and the clothing of the smoke jumpers that had jumped in on the Helena that died in the Man Gulch fire. And, for me, that's where safety was born. And, I think that's about the only thing. I just want to share that's very, very personal, but it's post-war, so it's about 1947, 46, 47 in there forward. So 9 Mile, it had its own 9 Mile Ranger Station. There were actually 2 different organizations located on the same, I guess today's vernacular would be a same campus, but we didn't think of ourselves as being on a campus, for God's sakes. But the fact is, so you ended up with the bunkhouse for the packers and the blacksmiths, etc. That was over on the remount side, and then on the National Forest side of it, or the administrative side that my dad worked on, was you ended up with people who marked timber and who scaled and who did all those kind of things. So there was almost like 2 little worlds that operated out there. They were quite different. And all the smoke chasers would be over on the side of the house that my dad had, and the people who were running the mule strings were on that other side. So, and then of course the smoke jumpers, they were a third entity that just kept working its way in and out of the whole situation because they ended up helping both sides. So from 9 Mile, we ended up moving to the Kootenai National Forest in Troy, Montana, and it was a very difficult assignment for my mother because she was crying right out the bat. But anyhow, that's just it was like it was just way more remote than Troy, Montana, and Troy was a tough town because you ended up with it was a town that had both the timber industry and the mining. That's all there was, and then you had the storekeepers and the schools. That pretty well covered 95% of the people who were there doing any kind of work at all, and she didn't necessarily fit in right away, but she learned how to do that, just as we all did. So, but it was a place where I would be in a fight every once in a while. One of the things that I had observed as a kid is that those who moved on up the chain of the Forest Service, I'd seen them when they were very young, and so that seemed like a pretty good path to follow. So that I knew from the very get-go, if I was going to be a forester, then I had to go seasonally with the Forest Service, and so I ended up with a series of seasonal jobs, and that. All of those were really great learning experiences for me and very rewarding too. Well, it was really frowned on for the kids to be involved with that kind of stuff. Every once in a while, I would be able to get a chance to go. I mean, fire for sure was something I always had an interest in. But I know the first time that I went with my dad to a fire down in Alberton, Montana, he pulled up and he started doing what he was going to do, and I got out and opened up the door of the truck. By the time he was backing out, and ended up tearing up the door of the truck, and he just, oh my God, why do I let my kid come with me? I think it was part of what he was thinking about. The interesting thing about it was the next day the truck had to go into Missoula to get fixed, and a brand new forester backed the truck out and took out the other doors. So it was like both doors of the truck got not wiped out, but really dinged up pretty good. And anyhow, it was very difficult. But I really did enjoy doing that whenever I could get away and be a part of that. But it's depending on how remote the areas were where the kids got to do much at all. Sometimes they had to. I mean, it's whether we realized it or not, there was a lot of areas where we didn't have a lot of help for anybody, and so you just did a lot of different jobs, just did. So I thought I wanted to be a civil engineer, and so when I graduated from high school, my first year at University of Idaho was that as a civil engineer, but it was obvious that I really didn't want to calculate angles and all of the things that they did. I'd much rather be out messing in the forest, so I moved over across. As soon as I made that switch in my major to forestry, I felt at home. It was, and that was interesting in that was the people. A lot of my peers were people who were just getting out of the Korean War, and so they had a vast knowledge about what the world was really like and what forestry was really like. And it was an interesting set of conflicts were set up then, because you ended up with these practitioners who knew more about life than the academic people did. And so every once in a while they would almost call them sunny or something, do something that would upset the instructors. But the fact is that the students frequently knew more about what the land was really about than what the instructors did. So. Well, every once in a while, my dad would offer suggestions because he was still very much so involved with the Forest Service, but it was more of a subtle thing. It wasn't, although there was a set of standards that he knew, and he didn't mind sharing those with me, and fortunately I embraced what most of those were. So, and then as a kid, I paid an awful lot of attention to what older people had to say, and one of the things that I found. The reason I became successful in many cases was that all I had to do was sit around the bunkhouse and the cookhouse and listen to what they had to say, and I would pick up some of that stuff. I found in the later part of my career then, it was almost like instructors at schools were telling the kids, well, when you get to that Forest Service assignment, you're going to find out that you'll meet this older person. He's going to come to you and try to tell you about the way the world is. And I've got to tell you, don't listen to what they're saying. And it's like, really, this is really something. So the way I learned, and I found it to be very, very successful for me, instructors at the schools were telling them don't do that because they didn't agree necessarily like cutting down trees, which is part of what Forest Service does. It was like, no, you just need to stay pure, and the purity then ends up with very, very narrowly defined people. So anyhow, that's a little one of those things that bothered me, that I saw a lot of really good kids who hung on a little bit too long to when they should have just been saying, I'm not in school anymore. I'm now at a new school of real life, and I want to start learning that way. So, but with my dad, I would definitely include a whole bunch of older people that were a part of that, because my dad was frequently in a very different place than where I was. I mean, a lot of my early assignments, he wasn't even in the area. He was in Washington D.C. or he was somewhere else. So it was really, there was just a group of people that really kind of looked after my welfare. Were very interested in me once I showed how interested I was in them. It was, and because that seemed like a natural to me. Just ask if you want to know how to do something. Ask those older guys. They know how to do it. And that included the clerks. We only females we had at that time were clerks in the office, and if you were to stop to ask them, they'd be more than happy to tell you how to do it. And if you didn't want to do it, then they didn't mind watching you drown a little bit. So, well, after I graduated from college, I ended up getting a master's degree from the University of Idaho, and then because I was going for my master's degree, I had to defer getting my commission, being commissioned as an Army officer, until after I got out of the school, graduated from the University of Idaho. So I ended up with anyhow, I ended up graduating from the University of Idaho. Now we're talking about the Vietnam War era. So I went to Fort Benning, Georgia from there. So I got to spend the next couple of years in Fort Benning, thinking I was on my way to Vietnam just every day, but it didn't happen. So, and at the very end of that, then I ended up getting married. So, and from Fort Benning, I ended up transferring to the Dorado National Forest in California. And the very first person that I got a chance to meet was Doug Leitz in the Forest Service. And he had the pleasure of telling me that I was not going to be going to Lake Tahoe, that I was, because I had been, all my paperwork said I was on my way to get a recreation job at Lake Tahoe. And what Doug got a chance to tell me was I got to be a forester on the Casunis district on the El Dorado, which was nothing more than a timber district. It had nothing else going on. And all those previous work experiences that I'd had were in timber, and I had said it as loud as you could say it those kind of times, saying, look, I don't want to be a forester just working in the woods all the time. I want to learn about recreation. I want to learn about a lot of other things. So it was a very interesting conversation that Doug and I had initially. But that you also did, you marched when people told you to do stuff. And I had just come out of the military, so that wasn't too difficult to do. No, I mean, there was not really necessarily a thing about not wanting to do timber as much as it was I need to be something different. I always set out I wanted to be a district ranger, and I wanted to be an incident commander, or in those days I wanted to be a fire boss. So that was what I'd set out to do, and continue to be if I got specialized in timber, then that meant that I probably weren't going to get to do the fire stuff that I was looking for. And it also didn't necessarily mean I was going to be a ranger, because the rangers really had a lot of different things that they could do. So from there, I went down to the Cleveland National Forest. And that's how I ended up my wife and I ended up in Santa Ana. And I should say, my wife just absolutely loved Placerville, and she didn't think that was such a bad assignment going to Santa Ana either, that even though we had 9 million people around us, she was able just to go be happily doing her thing as happily as you could be at a GS7 salary. it was pretty tough in Santa Ana because and I think I was promoted to a GS9 when I went in there, but anyhow, it was a pretty urban setting for sure, Santa Ana. I was like the assistant ranger or the resource officer. They interchanged the terms off and on, but if the boss was gone, the ranger, then I generally would be the person who would be in charge of the district. Cleveland, that's where I got a tremendous amount of fire experience. And so it was, and I would really encourage others to see that part of of what the organization deals with. It was like I had millions of people desperate for recreation. The organization had a tendency to look at the Cleveland National Forest as being a brush field, so when I'm asking for recreation dollars, people are saying, "Well, what? You don't have any lakes. You don't have any rivers. You don't even have any decent streams. How could you be talking about what a great place that is?" It's because that's all we have. Well, we'd have campgrounds, and they were full all the time. But we couldn't get hardly any money to explain them, and you had to be careful because you'd be really out in the heart of the brush field. Generally, our campgrounds are in the riparian zone, and so you had to be careful what you were doing there. You couldn't carve out a piece of flat ground and say, okay, we're going to put trees on it and that's going to be our campground in the future. Although that did happen. It was a good use for old landfill sites. It's 1970, 67, 70. It's very early 70s. It's the beginning of the hippie movements, all that stuff. Swimming nude was a big issue to be dealt with. Facial hair was a big issue to be dealt with. There was just a lot of kind of hippie kind of things were floating around at the time. And if I think I had a fairly broad-based exposure coming up through life. But the Cleveland with all the folks that were doing their counterculture kind of stuff, it was quite eye-opening for me. We had it very strongly, and I was on the Tribuca district of the Cleveland. Now, if you talked about the Tribuca district of the Cleveland and you went over to the Mount Baldy district of the Angeles, you would find the very same people dealing, and you'd find the Forest Service dealing with those very same issues. And it was, and the San Bernardino had a lot of their northern parts of their forest were dealing with the same kinds of issues. So we had, just counterculture people running around doing different stuff. The interesting part for me was that we were issuing citations on the Tribuca district for violations of resources and et cetera that it just was not happening on the rest of the Cleveland. On the rest of the Cleveland, now these folks are more San Diego oriented. They were real mellow people, and the fact is you still had this Navy town, heavy duty Navy town. And so when I talked about the craziness of what I was dealing with on a regular basis, it was like, what world are you in? There must be something wrong with you that you're inciting this strange behavior. It's like, no, you guys just don't understand that the world is quite different and very few miles apart. So that's what was going on. When I was on the Cleveland, we were dealing with the inner city gangs. The rest of the Cleveland was not. The rest of the Cleveland was busy just being mellow. And my recreation technician, one of them got really beat up good, just trying to do his job by a gang at the El Carrizo station. And then I went and said, we need to have radios. He had no radios at all available to him. He got the crap beat out of him, and we find out when he staggers into the station. So when I went out to get a radio, then I found the fire staff decided radios were part of the firefighting organization. We do emergency kind of stuff. We don't do recreation. You're going to have to find your own way of getting a radio system. Well, radio systems aren't a matter of just having a handheld. You've got to have repeaters. You've got to have support, all kinds of support to get the job done. So it turned out to be a really big battle that I had early on with a very strong fire person on the Cleveland. and we were. I'm not sure whether he could laugh about it now or not, but the fact is, but I had tremendous respect for him, but I didn't agree with what he was, how he kept throwing roadblocks in my way, and I finally did get it because I ended up talking to some kind of congressional person, saying this is the deal. I thought you guys were giving appropriating money for the National Forest System. I didn't realize you were thinking you were giving it just for the fire department. So anyhow, it's little ruffles there. From the Cleveland, moved to the Klamath National Forest and lived at Sawyer's Bar, California, which is there's about a grand total of 75 people at that time living in the town, and almost all of them worked for me. And so I went from a nobody in Santa Ana to where everybody in town knew who I was. They also knew what my wife did. They knew who my son was. If they didn't like the Forest Service, then they didn't bother to tell the kids, well, maybe just because I grumbled about it all the time at dinner, maybe you shouldn't have beat the crap out of the kid. And that happened a lot. So I ended up picking up more firefighting skills. I ended up with an understanding of like anadromous fisheries, because we had the salmon. We're working their way up the South Fork, the Salmon River. We ended up with a better understanding about watershed conditions and what that was all about, because there'd been some awful mistakes made by the foresters in the early development of that country. We were building roads way too big. We were switchbacking when over the top of itself in the middle of a clear cut. Watershed impacts were pretty staggering what had happened there. So there were a lot of mistakes that had been made, all done with great efficiency, I must say. But the fact is, they were some real mistakes that were being made. Not anybody set out to make the mistake. It was just people just didn't know. And so the Klamath was one of those wake up kind of things that says, you better be paying attention to what else is going on. And when people begin that conversation that maybe what you're doing is bad, maybe you better stop and listen to that conversation. But I got there in 75. And so interdisciplinary was a kind of a key way. We were still learning our way through that, but and there were a lot of organizations, or a lot of parts of the house we were doing multidisciplinary kind of thing. Multidisciplinary means that you're always going to be speaking from your perspective as a soil scientist or as a hydrologist, versus an interdisciplinary team which says, I thought I understood this to be. And you're talking about an area now that you're not necessarily trained in. But you're making observations and asking hard questions of people who are giving input into the process. And so you end up with better answers because others were getting to understand it was really okay for them to chime in and challenge what was going on there. So that didn't happen broad scale, but it happened quite a bit. Well, the Cleveland really didn't have a big call for interdisciplinary, and it couldn't afford to have it. You used people at the regional level basically to do the work that when you needed some interdisciplinary, a strange discipline kind of person coming in. So you didn't have a day-to-day work, but you did for sure on the Klamath. You had everybody that I needed was there. They were all sharing the same place, so it was a good thing to have. But it was like you better be making some money before you can have that kind of crew too. The part of the thing was that the organization for the Forest Service had a tendency to be saying, probably talking about if you don't give it fundus at this certain level, then we are not going to be able to keep your sawmills open, et cetera, et cetera. And so that part was being conveyed quite easily to a lot of folks and because more and more of our communities were really dependent on the Forest Service, the mining had pretty well dried up, and so they were really dependent on us delivering the timber. Well, there were a few of us that were saying, well, you're asking for more timber than what I think the land's going to be able to provide. And so we ended up with some wrestling because a lot of your decisions about how much money you're going to get for timber sales have been made in Washington, D.C., and they have no sense other than how much money is going to flow into the Treasury. And that's all they were trying to make decisions based upon. They didn't have a clue that, well, if you do that kind of stuff, you can maybe pull it off once, but if you do it twice, you may end up blowing a watershed out on you. They didn't, I mean, there wasn't any way that we could convey that information to the people that were controlling the budget stuff. So the mining law is one of those kinds of things that's been adjudicated over and over and over again. And you end up with people who live in the area, like along the Salmon River, had their own version of the way the world was. Then you end up with a version that the courts of the United States knew. And so that you were right off the bat, you were in conflict because everybody would talk to the old miners and ask them, and the old miners would say, oh, they can't do any of that stuff. You don't have to pay taxes, you don't have to do any of these kind of things. And so you end up with a really different set of how people saw the world. And there wasn't any way to measure, to wed that together for a lot of them. It was like, so all you could do is just be as fair to the people as you could be. But when I was ranger there, I said, if you're doing resource damage, or if you're brand new to the river, then I'm going to do what I have to do to get you out of this country. But if you've been here since 1934, mining your little thing, even if you don't mine at all, I'm probably not going to spend much time on it because I have other issues to wrestle with, like how did the salmon get up the river, etc. So what I said to the people is, you can become a priority for me, or you can just not. And so once they understood that's where I was coming from, then that seemed to make it better. It eased off anyhow. From the Klamath, then we came here. Here being the El Dorado. And it was like nirvana. It was, I ended up being the ranger here, also in the Placerville district of the El Dorado. My predecessor was Scully Parker, and Scully was an excellent ranger. He did a great job as far as timber management and range management, and he was a pretty good firefighter. He was a very, very well respected person, and the whole district was in pretty darn good shape as far as that goes. So it was really nice because I had picked up some debris at my previous assignment that never did get resolved necessarily, but this one, Scully had it together. So, well, you could see the attitude of the employees. They enjoyed coming to work. They enjoyed they felt like what they were doing was very worthwhile. The normal things that people looking for, feel comfortable that you're not. Your job's not at risk. You're as long as you do a good job, you'll be okay. But Scully and I ended up in different places because Scully expected the world to continue on in the world that he had, and the world that I inherited was not a result of anything he had done, but it was just a different thing. It was that the pressure to get more and more timber out was very, very strong. It ended up with some kind of conflicts. The result of that was that you ended up with people who had been very, very kind of quiet, sitting on the sidelines, were saying, "I'm not so sure what you guys are doing is the right thing to be doing." And if you really looked at it, sometimes they were right and sometimes they were wrong. But you ended up with a lot of organizations, especially in the environmental side, that said, "Hey, this is no good." But the trouble is, it was being dealt with on a large scale. It was like the environmental groups were using like Washington D.C. thinking that they couldn't get away from looking. Well, maybe we ought to be looking locally at what's going on. They ended up talking about the way the world is, and they were using it at clear cuts in Region 6, or they'd use, whether it was in Virginia. It could be anywhere. There were all these different bad things were happening, and everybody's just kind of laid it right that, well, that's what's going on in the National Forest. I mean, we just talked about the Cleveland. There wasn't any trees growing on the Cleveland about anything. So it couldn't have possibly been, but that same attitudes flowed across the lines. So it was from our standpoint, it was a pretty turbulent time. Well, I really enjoyed working with the people. They were, every day there would be a new challenge. Walk in the door. Every day there would be a new phone call. There would be a new something that would happen. I was one of the oldest tenured rangers in this region, and I never did get tired of the job. It was like the reason I left was just because. What are you going to be 100 years old and be the world's oldest district ranger, or are you going to do something different? So, I just chose to. It's time for me to move on, and there wasn't too much that I wasn't seeing that was brand new anymore. I guess I've always been a public servant, regardless whether I was going to get paid or not. And when I retired, one thing that I knew for sure, my old friend Scully Parker, I was not going to be a Scully Parker, a person who came back and tried to tell me, well, that's not the way we used to do it, because I knew the world was going to a very, very different place. So in many ways, I just decided I'm going to just leave the current organization, the Forest Service, alone. I don't understand all the new stuff that's coming down. I don't. But if there's a place maybe in the future, I'll look at it. But I walked out the door, and I really did walk out the door. Every once in a while, I'd hear from the ranger that's there now, and he would say, ask me some thoughts about it. I'd be glad to give that to him. But I don't want to tell him what his decision ought to be or anything else, because I only have a very small piece, so that's what he's conveying to me. So I needed to have something that was more what I thought would go forward in time, because I always wanted to leave the world a little better than what you found it. And so I found that I could, because of my experience in the Forest Service, then I could, in fact, I knew every supervisor for El Dorado County. I knew every community council member for the city of Placerville. I know an awful lot of the people who've been involved with making land use decisions across this spectrum, including the regional forester, et cetera. So it's been very helpful for me to be able to talk kind of like from a forestry guy in the background, but I had to make darn sure that, look, I'm not the ranger anymore. I am somebody different, and I think everybody honored that. I don't think you'll find that the Forest Service people here today are saying, well, that doggone guy, he really made our lives miserable. I did. I don't think you'll hear any of them say that, but I did help hopefully bring some views about what does it mean when a major wildland fire goes across the landscape, and what should you be worried about, and that kind of stuff. Well, when I retired, within the 6 months, I think I became the Park and Rec Commissioner for this district of the El Dorado, the county of El Dorado, because I'd got into I'd been a supporter of the new supervisor, and so it was the first time I'd ever seen what the world of politics is like when you're just starting a campaign and doing that. I found that to be fascinating. And how do you maintain your personal ethics when there's certainly some tugs that go on to say maybe you got to throw your ethics aside and just get an easy vote. And of course I see some of that being played out right now as we speak. So it's but no, it's been interesting to me that just so I from that perspective, I've been very much engaged in a lot of the recreation things that have been a part of El Dorado County for probably the last 20 years. Yeah, the way I view the world is that this area of El Dorado County should not be just known as the bedroom for Sacramento. That we in fact need to have a decent industry. We need to have places where people go to work. We're now one of the largest retirement communities there is. We have the oldest population in the state of California. It's bizarre to me that we have left behind. Well, what about, don't you want to see your grandchildren living anywhere near you, or you want to see your own kids anywhere near you? They've been priced out of our economy now, and people don't seem to think that's a big deal. They just like it to be left the way it is. Well, that's about the time you get that uttered out of your mouth and you turn 60, and then you find out you need some help around the house. And by the way, there are no young people that want to come and mow your lawn, but there are no young people that want to come clean your house. There's no young people, period, because we like it the way it is. Well, we're going to be paying very, very dearly for that. So and then people they assume that somehow we're going to continue just driving our cars everywhere we go. Versus in the olden days, if you looked at what a sawmill community looked like, you ended up with a company store. You ended up people walked to the company store. The people would walk home. They would spend time talking to their neighbors. Well, in many ways, that's kind of where we're heading, whether people like it or not. I don't think people really are against it. It's just they're very much against change. And that sadness, I have a profound sadness that how much energy gets put into stopping anything that's different than what exists today. So I would say you better have core values. People just don't get appointed to positions. You in fact need to earn it. You need to walk. You need to come up through some steps. You don't shake and bake and have a instant leader. Leaders are kind of trained, I think. They have a lot of people have some of the things that you need to have to be a leader, but the fact is training is a part of that, and it's I don't understand right now, particularly what's how we are hiring leaders or thinking we are getting leaders. It's because part of it is honesty. You have to have integrity. You need to be as honest as you could possibly be. When the things go wrong, you stab it up and say, "Hey, that was me. It was my watch. I take responsibility." Right now, I'm not seeing a whole bunch of that going on. Well, the timber industry has really had some rough blows, and some of it is a result of past abuses, particularly on private land. But when you drive onto the national forest, you don't know the difference between this tree is a national forest tree and this is a private land tree. It's just all green and must be all the same ownership, and that's not the case at all. So you ended up with like in this particular area, there was a Diamond Caldor railroads, and Diamond Caldor was a major lumber company here. It had 35,000 acres or so, and their whole thing was, let's cut out the big old sugar pines, make our siding and doing our molding and that kind of stuff. And when they're through here, we'll move on. It was just kind of an Eastern mentality that had been brought out here, and they just practiced it. And then when they got through, they ended up picking up the railroad, and then they wanted to sell the land, and they sold the land to the Forest Service. And so, but what they didn't do was they didn't have to deal with the debris then of what do you do with this community that's totally dependent on the sawmills. That's where Dad worked, whatever. So, so the communities then have to adjust, and most of the time they don't even know what they're doing. It's like, and I'm not so sure that's not what you're seeing played out now on the East Coast now, or the Rust Belt, where the whole driver for your community has just disappeared. We ought to be able to figure out how to do that better. But I think where the organization is going now, it's a very cumbersome process. It's going where you're getting a tremendous amount of input from people. Sometimes I'm not sure it's all being done scientifically, but you're certainly getting a lot of input from people, which is where you've got to be. I think those organizations that can pull off getting the protections in the landscape that needs to be there, and also producing products that generate some money, because you better be generating some money out there, or there's not going to be a future, as far as I can see. That's I think that they need to be celebrated, and I think there's going to be more and more examples out there. But well, if they're doing okay, why can't we do okay? And sometimes people just don't have the energy to continue to fight through the whole bureaucratic stuff that's out there right now. Well, if you really are interested in the long term, I think this is really a nice place for you to be invested in, because it's, I mean, a lot of the work that you start, like if you plant a tree, you'll never get a chance to see the tree cut down. Probably you'll end up, in fact, as you may even see it get burned up. But the fact is, it's you're really worrying about a landscape that's always in motion. It's some of it's living, some of it's dying, some of it's getting better, some of it's getting worse. It's always in motion. It's going somewhere, and that depends on which perspective you are. If you're a bird in a tree, you think about it perhaps differently than perhaps if you're somebody who wants to cut the tree down, or somebody who's fighting the fire, or whatever perspective you come from. You just love to walk in the woods. So it's kind of like you're going to get a chance to see how a lot of people view the same piece of ground, and you would hardly understand that it's the same piece of ground that you're all looking at. So to me, it's extremely fascinating getting to learn how to deal with people. There definitely is a difference, because one of the things that was very apparent was that those who had come out of World War II or Korea were very much, yes sir, well, whatever you need to have done. And the organization could really get a lot of stuff done as a result of that, because it was just like a regular military organization of sorts. By the time I retired, then I ended up having an organization like we need to be looking at how do we develop ourselves, how do we do a lot of these kinds of things that don't necessarily lead to groups getting work done as productively as sometimes we got done in the other past. That doesn't mean that the work we did in the old days was necessarily all good work. It was just, but it got done, and it got done very efficiently, but it was not necessarily the same when you really looked at it from a total resource standpoint. Should we have been doing that or not? But well, I mean, there was always a part of me. I was in Montana where I got started with my professional thing. Well, at the University of Idaho, I was a member of the Zeiss Society of American Foresters, and I was a Xi Sigma Pi kind of person at that time. And so I always carried this society with me. I was always glad that we had a society. It was one of those places where you could turn and say, somebody in the timber industry, can't you tell, we can't say much about it from a forester standpoint, but could you say something about it if we happen to have the same values? And people would do that. And so it was you could go back and forth across the line, helping each other out, trying to sell the whole world of professional forestry. So it was a very needed thing as far as I was concerned. Well, we're all so busy in transition from one place to another. We really don't know where we're transitioning to. But to me, I mean, I'm sure it's going to be very, very difficult to say why am I here. But the fact is, I think there is a role, and you need to continue to explore what that role is. And I think it'll emerge over time. That for one thing, forestry itself has got some very unique things, just as a salmon has some very unique things, just as grass growing on the flat lands is very unique. Somebody needs to be advocating for the forestry part of that life, and it's so far I'm not so sure that we feel very comfortable doing it, because what we've been doing in the past is being acquainted with cutting down trees, and it's like, actually forestry is quite a bit bigger than that, and it crosses so many different spectrums of what the wildlands are all about. But I appreciate the efforts that people are putting in, but I don't I don't want it to go away. But what I experienced was the transition from where it was man and mule against fire to people being delivered by air, as was the cargo being delivered by air. So you ended up with a tremendous. It actually was a battle inside the house of the foresters, called well, we're going to do it like we always did. We're going to keep on running our mules, and we'll do that. We'll build trails, and then you got these other guys that are saying, well, why don't we just fly a plane and do that same task? And that battle continues to today. I think that we've gone nuts as far as like all the media people want you to say, well, when are you going to get the they say, when are you going to get the DC-10 in here to make an airdrop? And I'm going, why would you be using a DC-10 for God's sake when you can do it with a shovel? I found it amusing listening to a newscaster saying, and we want people to shelter in place. She's looking at a lightning fire. I'm going, well, I would hope so. What else did you want to do today? It's like, it's the terminology, the use of this heavy duty equipment, though. My God, we can't afford as taxpayers to have this stuff going on. That lots of times a small air tanker will more than handle your job. There will be sometimes when it gets too big, but maybe we got to look at what the whole cost is going to be. Maybe we'd just be better off just buying the darn houses versus bringing in all these doggone pieces of equipment that are available. So we're too mobile sometimes. We're too aggressive sometimes. But I don't know how to get that one under control. Well, I don't think it's changed. I mean, what you have is the Cleveland in many ways is pretty constant because it burns very regularly. So every 20 or 30 years, you're going to end up with a pretty healthy sized fire goes through there, and then so you have a kind of mosaic, and it's always in play. That's all. It's just the vegetation is changing, and for that little community just got burned out or burned around, it's very odd and very dangerous and very concerning to them. But the fact is, the bigger scheme, it's just another one of those fires down in Southern California that you're dealing with. When I was down there, or when I first arrived down there, one of the things that used to happen was that from an administrative standpoint, you ended up with California Department of Forestry, you ended up with the Forest Service, and both of them had very excellent fire departments. And both of them thought they were probably the best around. And then you even had some smaller areas where people had some pretty proficient firefighting forces. One of the things that occurred while I was on the Cleveland was that we ended up with going into the instant command system. We began to change the whole way you look at stuff, because no matter how big an agency you might be coming from, there's not enough people in the world to stop a fire. So you end up having to figure out, well, how do we work with others? And so the instant command system then got us into a common language, and our communication skills picked up majorly. And so there was a lot of changes. How do you fight a fire in the future? But it was more like you still use those same basic tactical techniques, but the fact is you did it much differently. You did it with a lot of other people that you weren't necessarily familiar with. So in the early 60s, they went way through the middle 60s. The Forest Service went on a hiring rampage, and so that there was the competition then was really quite strong among those. Was how are you going to get out of this mess and move forward, so that was part of that when I talked about the forester thing. I was a forester, but there were other things I wanted to do. Well, there was a lot of competition for what that other thing was that I wanted to do. And it was just kind of a strange time that we actually had too many professional foresters at that time, and we needed more silviculturists, or not silviculturists necessarily, but soil scientists and hydrologists and some wildlife biologists that were more specialized than what we had. So, well, the Forest Service was found to not have hardly any women. I talked about early in my career. All I had there were district clerks, which were generally female, but that was about it as far as women goes. And so the court looked at that and said, well, I don't understand. Well, how could you have so few people when you see what the population of this country is like? Well, then you said, well, you don't have any people that are professionally trained to be in these roles. There's a lot of truth to that. But could it be fixed? And the answer is yes, it could be fixed. You end up with having to do some accelerated training. But that whole thing about it keeps on being played out is that there are times when the fact is you need to have some intervention and say we really do need to fix this. This is wrong. But there are other times when is there some solutions where you could ramp up and get to the very place you want to get to, and it won't eat up the people. But right now, it's or at least the way it was played out in my time, there was an awful lot of just let's eat up the people versus let's just get the task done and agree on what that task looks like. So let's see that now the Attorney General is going to take on the consent decree as part of a new initiative that the President's bringing in. Well, it was another one of these cases where you ended up with there were certainly reasons for a consent decree. There was no question in my mind, and there was a group of us who felt very strongly like, well, let's get on with it. Here's what the judge has told you to do. Do it, and it was pretty straightforward. I mean, I got it. Just to do management by objectives. What did the judge say? What did they find? Let's fix that. But then I found out it was kind of another side of the house deciding, by God, we're not. Nobody's going to tell us to do that. And it's like, so it turned out to be a big, very, very expensive fight. Didn't need to be, but I guess everybody who just enjoys fighting had a great time. And I felt so bad for the women that were involved with it because there were so many of them that were I just like to do my damn job. And now everything I do gets challenged. The only reason you got this job is because you're a woman. Well, that's not true. It wasn't true then. It's not true now. So, but that's kind of the setting that you dealt with. And so depending on what kind of camp you're in, you know, how your life was. And I really felt bad for our women, though. Just well, I think it'd be one where the people, the communities look at it and say, I'm really glad that's next door to me. I'm really glad for the jobs that are being provided for my community in there. I really appreciate the water that's coming from that I really appreciate the how outside issues have been dealt with, that there's tremendous ownership for the locals about what is the National Forest and values for it. And it also happens to be in tune with what the textbooks say, perhaps.